Hey guys, Cam here from PhoneDog.com, and there are tons of great choices on the Android market at the moment, and it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to choose between them. Two of the best on the market right now are the Sony Xperia Z2 and the HTC One M8. And we're gonna dogfight them to the death. Not really. And we'll start in the most obvious place, in design, hardware, look and feel, all lumped together in the design category. And the two are very different, although very similar at the same time. Both use a metal and glass combination, but the HTC One is almost entirely made of aluminium. Or aluminum if you're in the States. It has very curved back, very thin sides, brushed metal finished, it's got really nice rounded corners, and the gunmetal is quite shiny and slippery, whereas the Sony Xperia Z2 is front and back glass with a metal frame around the outside and very square in comparison. The corners are very slightly rounded, but only because they have to be, because if they were sharp then they would probably poke a hole in your hand. In terms of dimensions, both are pretty much the same length, although Sony's decided to make more use of it by adding a bigger display, whereas HTC's decided to put a huge bezel. And that's because of the BoomSound speakers, and we wouldn't want to get rid of those. Sony Xperia Z2 is noticeably wider, but it is a tiny bit thinner overall. But because of the HTC's curved back and its very slim edges, it does feel a lot smaller than the Sony in hand. Now, where you'll notice the biggest difference, I guess, in design is the fact that Sony has added these plastic flaps to cover the micro USB and the SIM and the micro SD slots. And this gives it its waterproof and dustproof capabilities. The HTC One, on the other hand, has gone on a very much more iPhone-style direction and put metal SIM card trays that you need to access using a SIM ejector tool. Overall, it's hard not to love the look and the feel of the HTC One. Despite its similar size, it does feel a lot smaller and it's very much more comfortable in hand. But we can't ignore the button placement on the Z2. They've put them in a place where it's really easy to reach with your thumb, whereas the power and lock key on the HTC One's placed right on the top edge, and it can be quite tricky to get to, especially if you're using it one-handed. The Z2 is also waterproof and dustproof, like I've already mentioned, and that does give it a little bit of a competitive edge. But overall, I would say that in terms of design and build quality and elegance, the HTC One really is the market leader here. Next, we look at the displays. Both are using LCD technology, 1080 by 1920 resolution, so both are full HD. HTC uses its own Super LCD 3 technology, whereas Sony uses an IPS LCD with its own triluminous technology. Is there a difference? In a word, yes. The HTC One's display might be 0.2 of an inch smaller than the Z2's 5.2 inch screen, but it's noticeably brighter, the colours are more vivid, and in times it's sharper. And this does help, especially when you're watching videos. You seem to see that the colours kind of pop more, there's a bit more contrast and a bit more life. But the Sony Xperia Z2, when you're looking at photographs, particularly of people and nature, it does have a more natural feel to it. But despite the Sony's display being bigger and having the Triluminous brand on it, I would still hand this round to the HTC One. It is clearer, crisper, brighter and more vivid, and not overly so like some AMOLED screens are. It's just a really nice display panel. And that's not saying that the Sony screen is bad. It isn't. It's still sharp, it's still got good detail, it's still got really good colour representation on screen. And now onto a category where the Sony Xperia Z2 really excels, and that's camera. Its 20.7 megapixel lens may boast lots of megapixels, but it does produce fantastic results. Both cameras do have a great set of manual controls. The HTC One has them already on the screen right at the bottom, easily accessible, and they're great for adjusting things like exposure, white balance, shutter speed, all the usual kind of stuff. And that's good. And they are pretty good at drawing in light when it gets to low light situations as well. But where the HTC One fails, and it's not because of the 4 megapixels necessarily, It might be a lower resolution, but it's still good enough. And what you might notice though is that it does produce some noise. Particularly when it does get to slightly lower light situations, you will start to see a bit of graining on your photos. And in this regard, the Sony Xperia does outperform. You get great depth of field, great color, great contrast, great everything. And although the Z2 is packed full of loads of really fun features that are great fun to use, what I will say is that the automatic mode on the Sony Xperia Z2 is among the best automatic modes I've ever used on a camera. It automatically picks up what kind of scene you're in and takes a shot that kind of highlights those. So if you're in a low light shot, it automatically knows that you're in a low light shot and it will boost the performance into night mode and you get really great performance. Now both have this sort of funny background defocus. HTC One has the U-focus, which isn't necessarily background defocus because you can select the front or the back image and choose to focus on either the background or the foreground. And that choice is quite nice, but results are quite patchy. And results aren't always perfect with the Z2's background defocus either. But in my experience with both phones, with both cameras, you don't really need to use it anyway. If you want to create a macro shot or something with an image that's really close up, they both do a pretty good job of blurring out the background and giving you a really nice bokeh effect. But overall, the Z2's camera is fantastic, and to top it off, it creates videos in 4K resolution, which just is better than full HD. Onto the category of battery life, and you only need to look at the spec sheet to realise that the Xperia Z2 is going to be better. It has a 3200 mAh battery, whereas the HTC has 2600 mAh. That's 600 mAh difference, and you can tell in daily use. I would class myself as a regular or light user of mobile phones, and I got my Sony Xperia Z2 while I was using it as a daily driver to last me more than a day and a half, sometimes up to 2 days on a single charge. With the HTC One, I probably got around a full day every time. If I was quite restrictive with use, sometimes I would get a day and a half out of the battery, but there really is a difference, and both of them have unique power management tools available in the software. Sony's stamina mode cuts out certain tasks like background data, and HTC One has the extreme power saving mode that cuts the phone down right to its very core basic features. But all in all, in battery life, the Sony Xperia Z2 wipes the floor with the HTC One quite convincingly. Now on to the performance of the phones, and looking at the spec sheets you would presume that both are pretty much the same. They both have the same Snapdragon 801 2.3 GHz quad-core processor. They also both have the same Adreno 330 graphics processing unit. Where they differ is the Sony Xperia Z2 has 3 GB of RAM, whereas the HTC One M8 has 2 GB of RAM. In daily use, both are pretty fast. You can switch between apps effortlessly on both. They are quick, they get things done, there's not really much lag. But in daily use, what I did find is that certain things seemed and looked faster on the HTC One. Scrolling through Facebook or web pages, there wasn't a lot of judderiness. It was very smooth. Launching different apps was smooth almost every time. Sometimes with the Xperia Z2 I found a little bit of lag. Sometimes the screen wouldn't respond the first time when I touched it, and it was just kind of like split-second things. It wasn't a major problem, but it is noticeable in some ways that the HTC One is just a smoother, faster, more reliable phone in terms of use. Another area where the HTC One comes out on top is in sound performance. These BoomSound speakers with their inbuilt amp are just fantastic. Whether you're watching a video, playing a game, just listening to music on loudspeaker, it's not just the volume but also the range in depth of tone that you get from them. You get a decent bass, nice treble, good middle. It's not like you've got the highs and lows and nothing filling it in between. It's a really nice and really good quality sound. Now the Sony Xperia Z2 also has front-facing stereo speakers, but they just really aren't a match for BoomSound. They're not as loud when you're watching media, even though they do produce quite a decent sound. And actually when you're playing a game or watching a movie, it is quite a good experience. Compared to any other phone, it would be probably the best, at least for media. When it comes to notifications, they're quite terrible. I can't remember how many notifications I've missed purely because I haven't heard the sound go off. It's a good job that it has a notification LED on it, because otherwise I'm pretty sure I would miss most of my notifications, especially when my phone's in my pocket. In this category, BoomSound just wins, and it would win against pretty much every phone on the market. So in all 6 key categories added up, the HTC One wins 4 of them versus the Sony Xperia Z2. Now if you were to ask me personally which phone is the best, looking at the results I've just got, the HTC One would seem like a fairly obvious choice, but it does depend on where your values lie. For me personally, I love camera and I really love good battery life. For me personally, the Sony Xperia Z2 has been the better phone. But objectively, and looking at the performance and looking at all the categories that we just have, it's hard to ignore that the HTC One M8 is possibly the best phone on the market right now. I'm at PhoneDog_Cam on Twitter. If you want to ask me any questions or shout at me or tell me how wrong I am, please feel free. Use Twitter or the comments below. And I will see you again soon.